Hello Sunshine and welcome back to my channel, Sunshine in My Code. My name is Soahudi Matlapeng, and in this video we're going to be talking about cloud architecture. Before we get started with this video, please remember to subscribe to my channel, like the video, and comment down below if you enjoyed the content. When we talk about cloud architecture, we're referring to services that we can use on cloud platforms to either do some computing on the internet or run or deploy your service over the internet. And when we talk about the cloud, we're actually not talking about anything in the sky. These are actual physical buildings, and inside of these buildings there are servers and other hardware that you can rent for a fee a month to be able to do whatever you'd like to do with it. And that can be storing images, storing your website, or running a server, running a database, and a wide variety of things. And in today's video, we're going to be talking about some of these services. And when we talk about these services together, they form what we call the cloud architecture. So cloud architecture is actually all of these services and sub-services and how we can use these services together to, deploy an application or do whatever we'd like to do on the internet. The first service we're going to talk about is storage, and storage just allows you to store anything. This could be an HTML file, an image file, or a text file or a JSON file, right? Anything you may want to store and pretty much expose on an HTML browser as is, that's what you'd want to use storage for. So we can use storage to host all the static files in your application. So if your application is literally just your HTML file, you can put it in the storage and it will render the file as is. In essence, you can literally just simply deploy your first application using storage. In Google, it's called Google Storage, and in AWS, it's called AWS Simple Storage Service, also known as S3. You've now got your static files loaded, but you're wondering, how would I deploy something like Django, which needs a server running in the back end, right? So for this, you will actually need some kind of virtual machine, and you'd need to actually be running your server on a virtual machine. And in Google, it's called the Google App Engine, and in AWS, it's called Elastic Cloud Computing, also known as EC2. And this allows you basically access to a virtual machine, and you can use that virtual machine, SSH into it, and run your application. This could be something as robust as pulling it from GitHub and then just running it as you would on your own machine, or you can deploy something super fancy like a container and get that container. Every time that something is pushed to that container restarts the process inside of your server, and now you've kind of got like a bit of a fancy setup to deploy your application, but it also requires a bit more work around the Elastic Cloud Computing to get it running. So let's say now you've got your backend application running, such as your Django application or Node.js. What you're probably wondering is, what do you do with the data in your application, right? Are you gonna just use Postgres inside of your Elastic Compute, or where do you put it? And for that, we have relational databases that most clouds relational databases, and in AWS it's called RDS, and in Google Cloud it's just called Google Database. And what this gives you is access to a database, and then in that database you'll be able to store all the memory for your application. So for instance, your Elastic Compute or your Google App Engine actually communicates to your RDS, your relational database that is stored elsewhere. And the reason this is really important is because when you have your server running, if your server shuts down or something happens to it, you don't want your database to be affected, right? So every time your site is down and something's happened and you have to restart this, you actually don't want your database to be affected by that. Another cool thing that you can do, now that your database is running separately and you've got your server running, if your application has more users, you can actually create more servers running. So instead of having one Elastic Compute or one app engine, you can have 2 app engines or 3 app engines that can manage all the traffic to your site. So when users come into your application, you'll have more than one server running to kind of handle all those requests. But you're probably now wondering, so if I have 3 servers running, how does each server know which requests to take and how to take, and how do you manage requests between those three servers? And that is where the load balancer comes in, right? So your load balancer in AWS is called Elastic Load Balancer, and it's elastic just because it allows scaling. And then in Google, it's just called the Google Load Balancer. What it does is it puts all your Elastic Compute or Google App Engines, essentially all your servers that are running, in a private subnet that only your load balancer has access to, and your load balancer sits as the actual domain or access point for your application. And then anyone who hits a request to your application hits it through the load balancer, and the load balancer is aware of how many computes or apps you've actually got running. So when traffic comes to your site, it goes straight to your load balancer, and what your load balancer does, it decides which of your servers it wants to handle the request. So let's say, for instance, you've got your Django application running or your Ruby application running, and you've got 3 Ruby applications running. Your load balancer sits in front of them, and then every time traffic hits your website, your load balancer decides which of your servers actually handles that request. And if a server goes down or if a server has been unresponsive, your load balancer will be responsible for shutting it down and starting another one and making sure that all your servers are actually healthy. So this means that with more incoming traffic, your load balancer can kind of just distribute all that traffic. And as your servers go up and down, your relational database or Google database is actually sitting separately and is unaffected by your servers going up or down. So now what this looks like overall is that you've got your front-end application, which you can store in a server too, but it's not really standard front-end practice anymore. What you actually do is you get a static file generator, or you just you bundle up your front end into HTML and JavaScript file. And because those are static files, you can actually store all your static files in your storage. So that can be an S3 bucket or Google storage. You store all of that in one application, and then your storage is actually the access point to your website. So anyone who's hitting yourapp.co.za is actually going straight to your storage, and your storage then communicates to your load balancer that, hey, this file actually has a request for a backend, and your load balancer goes, okay, cool. Which one of these servers, or in essence, the backend of your application is now running on multiple things? Which one of these is actually going to handle this request? And then it picks a server, any one that it's based on some calculation to kind of determine which one should run this service. And then that server is the one that actually runs your request. And then it communicates to the database, gets a turn to do some computations or just some reading from the database. And then it can actually process that request, sends the data back to the load balancer, and the load balancer communicates back to the front end. And your front end application is actually what serves the actual HTML file for your application. But now you're wondering, okay, cool, how do I buy a domain and all that stuff? And buying a domain, you can actually also do that on a cloud platform. So in AWS, it's called Route 53, but in Google, I believe it's called Google Domain Manager. Yeah, it's DNS, Google DNS Manager. So you can actually just buy your domain and attach it to your S3 bucket if you're using a bucket or storage. If you're using storage to deploy your front end. But if your application is actually just fine running on a server, you can actually attach that domain name to the server or to your load balancer if you're using a load balancer. This just makes it a lot easier. So the key takeaway from this video is actually not how many services there are. There are so many services that you can use. The key thing is to understand how these services work together and which one you can use for your application, and that just helps you. It's important to start with one service and then build your way up. You can decide to be like an expert at that service. You can actually get a certificate. You can get an AWS EC2 certificate, meaning that you're an expert at this thing. Or you can just be really good at deploying applications in a certain way, and that's what helps you. And it all depends on what you want to do. I feel like cloud architecture is like such a wide field, and you can do literally anything. There are so many services. Don't get overwhelmed. To start with one thing and enjoy it. Thank you for watching Sunshine in My Code. I would really appreciate it if you liked this video and subscribe to my channel, and I'll see you in the next video.